The Ensombl Advice South Africa podcast is intended for professional financial advisors. All discussion is limited to publicly available information and should not be interpreted as legal, professional, or financial advice. Ensombl Advice is not a licensed financial services provider and does not provide financial services. Before making investment decisions, you should obtain financial advice from a qualified financial advisor.
Hi, I'm Louis van der Merwe, Certified Financial Planner. Join me every week where I get to have discussions with global leaders in the financial planning space to help you serve your clients better and run a more efficient financial planning practice. This is Financial Planners South Africa podcast.
Portfolio Metrics is thrilled to bring you this podcast in support of our common passion for people and the evolution of wealth management. Our global business links precision investment management to expert financial advice through partnerships and technology. Portfolio Metrics is an authorized financial services provider. ComSpace is a revenue management solution developed specifically for independent financial advisors. It is a web-based application that tracks, allocates, and manages advisor revenue. The system seamlessly reads commission statements from financial institutions and can address any permutation of commission splits. ComSpace provides mind-blowing, out-the-box revenue business intelligence and analytics, along with super flexible reporting to effectively manage and grow your business.
Welcome to another episode of Ensombl Advice South Africa. Today in the studio, I have with me Rob Macdonald. Rob is the head of strategic advisory services as Fundhouse and has a very long LinkedIn bio. So I'm not going to go through all of the elements and all of the hats that Rob wear. Rob, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks very much. It's great to be with you. Thank you.
I think we're in for a treat today because you wear so many hats in this industry, and yet you seem to tackle each of these elements with so much intention and so much passion. But before we talk about these different hats that you're wearing, I'm curious, how did you get into financial services? We often hear people just stumble upon this, and I'd love to hear your origin story, as we call it.
Yeah, Louis, it's probably a very good place to start, and stumble is probably the right word to use. But before I was in financial services, I was actually in academia. I was working at the Graduate School of Business at the University of Cape Town, and I had been there for 4 or 5 years. And at the end of 1998, I'm giving my age away here, but at the end of 1998, during 1998, I got approached by another person whose name originally was Barry O'Mahony, who was at the time joining a sort of a startup business that was a business which had Brait as a shareholder and a business in Australia called IPAC, and that new business was going to be called IPAC South Africa. So it was new, and Barry approached me pretty much out of the blue and said, would I be interested in joining this startup? And I didn't know much about financial services at the time, and so I had a coffee with him, and he explained to me what this business was going to be about and what was unique about it. And I think, in a sense, the story behind that business is really why I suppose I was excited about getting into financial services, because it was basically going to try and transform how financial planning was done, how financial advice was given. The idea behind it was a concept known as lifestyle financial planning, which you've probably had discussed on your podcast before. I don't know, has Barry been on your podcast?
Barry, not. We have had quite a few advocates of lifestyle financial planning, of which Dirk Groeneveld is probably the most vocal one.
Yes, exactly, yeah. Yeah, so that I met Dirk in those days long ago. But I think the point of the story was that I was excited to get involved with a sort of effectively a startup business. It was coming out of Brait Unit Trust at the time. I think I was the 6th employee. It was headed up by Andrew Bradley, who you also have had on your podcast, I don't know. But the point of the story is that it was I did stumble on it in the sense that I didn't plan to go into financial services. I obviously knew a little bit about it. I had also been on the receiving end of financial advice myself, and my father, in fact, the financial advice he had received had been interesting, and so it was quite easy to see why this concept of lifestyle financial planning was a good thing, and I am sort of curious about the fact that it's still seen as a relatively new concept 20 years later. And I suppose it just shows how much work we still have to do in the industry to get past the legacy of this being a sales-based industry. But so what was interesting about that, my move, was that I actually got recruited into an investment role within IPAC. It was actually to head up the investment research team and then to sort of do investment research and to run portfolios for financial planners. And you'd be, well positioned to ask me, well, what do you know about investments? And I knew very little. But it was actually, and again, I think this talks to some of the challenges we face in the industry. It was testament to, I suppose, the foresight and the wisdom of the chairman of IPAC at the time, a guy named Uluna Bay in Australia. And he was the chairman of the Australian business who wanted somebody to come into that role without any baggage, without any history. Because, as you know, if you're trying to shift things and change things, it's very hard to undo stuff. Much easier if somebody comes in with a clean slate. So I came in with a clean slate and was all starry-eyed and excited about the prospect of lifestyle financial planning and of doing things differently in financial planning and in the industry as a whole. So that's how I made the transition from academia to financial services.
Rob, I'm curious what the response was of your family. You're saying, I'm going to quit this steady job in teaching and I'm going to join a startup, effectively. What was the conversation around the dinner table? Did you include your family, or was it, hey, I've already done this?
So, fortunately, at the time, I was still single. And so I didn't have to consult my family or bother them with that. But even though it was a startup business, it had some backers. So in fact, the transition wasn't that uncomfortable. If that makes any sense. It wasn't like I was having to, dip into my bond and pay myself a salary. Brate and IPAC were the funders of the business at the time, and so salaries were paid, etc.
Rob, then how would you approach that life transition if you were to do that today? If this opportunity came about today, given where your life is now, would you have approached it differently?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, it's that's an interesting question. It's I've got 3 teenage children and a wife and 2 dogs and a home, and it would be a very different conversation if I was going to jump into a startup where perhaps the future is uncertain. Yeah, and I think your point is a good one, is that you've got to have your family on your side if you're going to do something like that. But no, I fortunately at the time was able to make the transition with most of the conversations being with myself rather than with others, and trying to work out if it was the right thing for me or not. And so that was interesting time.
They say that's the secret to an intelligent conversation is talking to yourself. So thankfully now, with perfect hindsight, we can say that it was a successful move, right? But there's something to say about people taking that risk early on in their career. I've spoken to a few career changers where in their mid or late 50s have said, hey, I'm going to change careers. I'm going to change. We had Joe van Niekerk on, and that changed from being a full-time musician to becoming a paraplanner. We've spoken to some people that were teachers, right? Policemen. These are all the roles that you heard traditionally that moved into, let's call it maybe the sales-led advice side. Is that still something we're seeing today? Is it common for people to actually change careers and move into financial services later on?
I mean, I think interesting you used the term, the sort of the sales leg. I think there is an appeal to that move. If you're looking at it from a sales perspective, because obviously somebody who comes into financial planning and potentially is seen as a distributor of product, then the more life experience and the more networks they have, probably the greater potential they offer. What I'd like to think is that what we're seeing more of, and maybe this is just the front end of the advice sort of move in the industry, is more qualified people coming in who want to do things right. So more accountants, NDAs, who are saying, that this financial planning is important stuff, and I want to do it right, and that's why I'm coming in, rather than, as I think has happened historically, as you mentioned, teachers from, were coming, mid-career, and others, and I think they were seen more as a funnel into a network. I'd like to think that we are moving beyond that, but I may be a little bit idealistic in that regard. But I did have a meeting last week with a financial planner who is an electrical engineer, MBA, Rhodes Scholar, all of the credentials, and sort of made a career jump in sort of mid-40s to financial advice, and then for the reason being to do it properly. So I'm hoping that becomes more the route that people follow to get into the industry or the profession.
I mean, that's fascinating. You mentioned there for the reason to do it properly. Is that to deliver financial planning properly? But what was attractive for that person to move at that age in their life to financial services?
They were already in one arm. I mean, I've got cautious so I don't want to go into too much detail because I haven't asked for the permission to share the story. But I think
protect
it's more.
The innocent.
But I think the principle of it is that it was about seeing, and I can talk to my own story as well in this regard. And then why I was quite fired up to take on the challenge that Barry's invitation gave me was I had seen, and a number of people have, and I said, I know of people who have done this for the same reason. I had seen how my father received financial advice. So, he was an engineer, he was professional, his whole life, worked 40 odd years, always had a job, but made one mistake. He kept moving from job to job, and he didn't stay in one corporate for 40 years. So he worked for a number of different companies, had an interesting career, and trusted his financial advisor. And when he retired, he had a lot of these products of a particular color, which I won't mention, and those products amounted to very little in terms of real asset value. And so my father's sort of best investment was, 4 sons who were able to sort of provide some assistance to him, and who's no longer alive, but my mother, who's now 92, is still alive, and, to provide assistance to them. So the point being is, even an educated professional employed for their whole life did not have enough money when he retired. And I think, to go back to the advisor I was talking about, I think he had seen similar, scenarios play out with other people. So it's about seeing bad advice being given. And literally in my father's case, I would say no advice being given. I would say products being sold to him, and being a trusting person that he was, thought of that his advisor, in inverted commas, was doing the best thing for him. Just trusted.
Robin, in your opinion, what would you have said went wrong there? I mean, it sounds like your dad might have outsourced a lot of the decision making and saying, "Hey, you need to make this decision on my behalf." Is that something that's fair? I know that's probably with hidden agendas as well, and someone that had to sell additional products. But at the same time, how do we get our clients to also take a bit of responsibility? Because ultimately, this is also their financial lives, not to do them in, but to say, hey, there's a balance between taking on the responsibilities that clients are ready to let go of, and also giving some of that back. I'm just curious to hear your take, and by no means is this a reflection on what happened to your dad, but if we can learn from what happened there, I think it would be helpful.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think the can definitely learn from that in the sense that he was pretty relaxed about life and laid back, and so was happy just to trust. So I think you're absolutely right. I think there's definitely, it's incumbent upon clients to be advocates for their own financial health. If you talk about physical health, at the end of the day, we have to be advocates for our own physical health, and I think we have to be advocates for our own financial health. But I think that there are two elements to that. The one is our lives, and I think that we are all the experts in our own lives, and we need help at times to navigate what life throws at us or where we want to go in life. But in general, we really are responsible for the decisions we make in our life. But financial planning is about our life and our money. And so when it comes to the money bit, I think we need a financial planner to help us marry those two concepts together. And I would like my financial planner to act as a sounding board to me around my life issues, and to act as a sounding board and an expert for me on my money issues. So to go back to your question, I do think that it's a responsibility of the financial planner to, first of all, enable their clients to come to insights and decisions around their life that are meaningful and help them to do that. But those are the client's decisions. And then once the clients have made those decisions with your support, that when it comes to now, okay, well, what are we going to do about the financial stuff? That I can trust that you're going to give me, sound advice around how I can best achieve what I want to do in my life with whatever money I have available or need to have in the future. And I suppose for me, what was missing in my father's scenario is I don't think there was a genuine interest in my father's life and an interest in helping him get where he wanted. I think what it was simply a case that, and this is I think I'm going to use the word tragic, legacy of our industry, of our profession and industry, is that the financial advisor simply saw their role as somebody who, because they got remunerated on commission or product being sold, that was the primary focus. And what to say that, if my father had died and he had some life policies that he had taken up, that wouldn't have been a wonderful thing to have had in place, But the reality is that, his board of financial affairs weren't properly looked after. So I think it is about challenging clients to take responsibility for their financial health, but then providing the sort of expert assistance to helping them achieve it.
It sounds like it's more nuanced than just saying, oh, the financial planner failed or the industry failed your dad at that point. It's what you're saying is this balance between, your life and then also your finances. And I want to talk about that a little bit. You are very involved in the coach training side, and wherever you look, probably for the last 2 or 3 years, you were hit over the head with the fact that financial planners need to learn coach training skills. Is there a place where we go too far, where financial planners only spend time on a client's life, yet neglect the actual real technical finances? Is that happening? Or do you see an alternative where, we talk about this kind of linking up with robo-advisors to become a cyborg advisor, which is a very interesting term. I'd just love to hear Rob's take on where this is going, because we've seen this back and forth in the industry around training and retraining, and then some people saying, oh, you need higher technical skills as well. So I know that's a lot, but
no. So I think if we the way I look at it is I look at it to say that we need to start off with the identity and role of the financial planner, and say, well, what is your identity and what is your role. And I would start off to say the identity is financial planner, and the role is to help people, because the point I will make, no matter where we go with ChatGPT et al., is that the clients of financial advice are always going to be humans. So we're going to make that assumption. So the role of the financial planner is to help the human being make and implement decisions about their life and money. So that's their role. And so I do worry that as you say, there's been lots of talk about coaching and therapy and financial transitionalists and different types of financial specializations. Whereas I think that ultimately what clients need are financial planners who are adept at with human skills, because the robo advice piece is going to become more and more sophisticated, and I do think the future is one where the equivalent of Alexa or Siri will sit in your office, and you will just sitting with a client, you will just throw any technical query you have into the ether, or just say, Alexa, what was Rob's RA contribution in 2022, and can he top up? And that answer will just immediately be given to you. So you will need to have technical understanding and all of that, and you need to know what can and can't be done. But ultimately, you're not going to have to sit and crunch numbers for very long, because AI is going to give you all the answers you need. So then, what is your role? And I think your role is then to help me make decisions about my money and my life. And because you're getting so much help from ChatGPT et al., I think that it's going to be inevitable that you as a financial planner or financial planners in general are going to have to develop the human skills. But they're still going to be financial planners. And this is the part that I think is important to stress, is that, financial planner is not a psychologist, not a counselor, is not a coach. Financial planner is a financial planner. Can they use skills that therapy, counselors, coaches use? Absolutely. And will they enhance the way they do their work? Absolutely. And will the outcomes be better for clients? Absolutely. So I don't know if that answers the question, Louis, but I do worry that you're hearing about people who now position themselves as a financial coach. Yeah, there are even people who, I know in the UK probably more than here, but financial coaches who are not licensed to give advice, but they are helping people make sort of choices about money and life, but they're not licensed to give advice, And I think the key here is that financial planning is a profession that's regulated. You're helping people make very important decisions, and hopefully you are enhancing that ability to do that with as many advanced human skills as you can get.
I really like how you position it, where we're almost borrowing or being inspired from all these other helping professions. Yeah. Are there any of the professions that you think maybe haven't been under the spotlight where we could learn from to say, hey, like, what is that profession doing that we can bring into financial planning to make things a little bit better? You often hear about people saying, take the example of going to a dentist and do the exact opposite. So is there something similar that we can think about? And then at the same time, if I'm a paraplanner, I would be really worried, because traditionally the role of a paraplanner was this heavy lifting, right? It's the technical pieces around your financial plan to compile this, to get this all in together. Like, where do they go from here?
Yeah. I mean, that's a good point, and I'd be hesitant to give an answer to that. I mean, I think it's because the other thing that we have learned about, for example, ChatGPT, is that it does get things wrong, and so you may still need paraplanners to make sure, that whatever is generated by the computers is actually accurate and do some sense making of it. So I think, I don't want to make a prediction around that, but I do think there needs to be human understanding of the technical and human application to the technical, But to go back to your question about other professions, it's quite interesting. I'm reading a book at the moment called The Myth of Normal by a medical doctor named Gabor Mate. And he's written a few books around the medical profession. And his whole thrust is that the medical profession is missing out on the body-mind connection. And it's historically treated people purely physically, as opposed to recognizing the impact that our context, that our emotions, etc., have on our health. And even though in the medical profession this has been recognized by various people over the last 100 years, that there is this connection, the mainstream medical profession is not implementing that insight very effectively. In other words, you go to the doctor, and he relates a number of stories in this book about the fact that people who are ill get interrogated on the physical front that don't get interrogated about, the potential, psychosocial factors that could be influencing their health. And so what I would say and what I've sort of seen that is more what can we learn from what they're not doing. So you said about the dentist and do the opposite, but in a similar way here, I think that we, I like to say that as human beings, the longest relationship we have is with money. So before you're born, you're in the womb, and your mother has a relationship with money in some form or another. And depending on the level of stress of that relationship or not, it will impact you in utero. And then when you're born into a family or into an environment where there's money, and then after you die, there's still a relationship with money. There might be somebody left over, there may not be, but that has implications. And I think what we can learn from that is that there are factors that influence how we interact with money and how we behave with money that require greater understanding of the human being sitting across the table, And so my sense of it is that let's try and do better than the medical profession. And I realize I'm a danger of health who might be listening to this and be, anyway, I haven't said anything too incriminating, and I'm assuming you'll cut it if it is. But the point is, let's try and. But I think technology is going to force us to do this. Is to force us to keep that focus on the human and how we can help the human make those decisions, because technology is so powerful. It's a long way around to say that there's nothing dramatic that I'm seeing. I mean, obviously there are things that we can learn. But I think people are doing that already, things we can learn from other professions or other industries, the power of visual, for example, and how people, process pictures well, but, as opposed to words and numbers, the power of metaphor, so we can learn something from how people tell stories, how stories are very powerful, so there are lots of things we can weave into it. And I think that's what makes financial planning such an amazing profession, is that it can draw on so much around life and make it relevant to clients.
I think it's maybe worthwhile for us to talk a little bit about what you're saying in the medical field, where if you listen to a lot of the mental health practitioners, they say it's not helpful to put a label on someone. In fact, we don't even want to diagnose someone with a disorder. We're going to treat the person. But in the same breath, we're hearing people that are experiencing financial disorders. And I'm wondering, is it helpful to even start labeling these financial disorders, money hoarders? And if you read any of the Ted and Brad Klantz's work, they talk about the money script, and invariably it leads to there's something wrong with you and we need to fix it. What you're saying, Rob, is how do you treat the whole person? And for someone that's passionate about the psychology side of money, how do you start treating someone and their money when you look at the whole person, as opposed to the label that we can easily put on someone? Oh, that person is stingy. Oh, that person, you name it.
Yeah. You sort of getting me to touch on one of my other hobby horses, and that is this idea of labeling. I think where it started in the simplistic form, where labeling started in our industry or our profession. I keep using those words interchangeably because, we are hopefully a profession within an industry. But where I think the labeling started is with the risk profiling. So, you get a client and you've got to do a risk profile, and you can now label them as conservative or aggressive, moderate, and then you have the rationale for how they should invest their money. And that has now evolved to, as you mentioned, Brad Klontz, but there are others, and there's a lot of research in South Africa. A number of the big institutions are now producing different profiles of clients, different profiles of advisors, and you are one of 6 or one of 4 or one of 8 or one of 10. And I think my concern about that is that it doesn't recognize the complexity of us as human beings. And so I think that's why financial planners are going to become so skilled, because each person sitting across the table from you is unique. And yes, they may have a money script, but can you really, give it a label? Because is it so, are there only so many scripts that can be given that label? I'm not sure. But what I can do is I can connect with that person. So I think what we're offering as human beings is connection, because we are social beings and we thrive in connection. So if we look at, and it says some research that came out in the last couple of weeks, it's been quite widely publicized about people's health and happiness in life. And the number one factor is relationships. That relationships are the biggest indicator of how long people live, how healthy they live. And that's because we're social animals. So I think we're looking for connection. And for me, a label almost drives disconnection. Okay, Louis, you're a conservative. Okay, now we know what you are. Now let's decide. But
you have your box. Not fit in it.
Exactly. Yeah. So I would rather be looking for things that are driving connection rather than disconnection, and rather, looking for ways for clients. And I think going back to my father's story, looking ways for clients to take ownership of their financial life. If, in a sense, if I label you, I'm disempowering you. If I'm disempowering you, I'm not expecting you to take ownership. Whereas, if we treat you as a complex being, and we, let's talk about what money was like when you were young, when you were growing up. How was it? And then that can start to inform, okay, hang on, Louis, maybe that's why you're nervous at the moment, or maybe, Louis, that's why you've got too much money in cash, because you had that experience when you were young, blah, 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 blah. And we can start sort of almost doing detective work together, and I think that's the role of the financial planner increasingly, is playing this collaborative role. I like to talk about the fact that financial planners have three roles, actually. So the first role is that of a thinking partner. So we think together. And how do we think together? We think through conversation. So the more skillful our conversation is, the better we'll think together. And then once we've done our thinking, and once we've got a sense of where you, the client, are at, then we come to looking at what are the choices that face you. And so that I like to talk about. Your second role as a financial planner is that of a choice architect. You help clients make choices, and that's again collaborative. You can't play that role without being collaborative. And then the last role, the third role that I think financial planners play, and this is the one that's been thrown around a lot, so I'm cautious to say it, but I do think there is a behavioral coaching role that a financial planner plays, and I simply say that because more and more research shows that it's the way people behave around money that affects their outcomes more than anything else. So it's not about where I invest my money that makes a difference. It's about how often I save, how consistent I am, in doing that. And so as a client, I need you, Louis, to actually give me a kick up the backside and say, Rob, listen, you're spending too much money. Come on, can't we find a way for you to spend less and save? And so there you sort of see that sort of coaching role coming through. So I think, I'm not a fan of labeling. I mean, the other labeling that we're seeing, and I actually saw a business in the UK that came out trying to help financial planners work out what bias a client was suffering from, and then counteracting that with some technology and et cetera, and to try and work out, whether you've got a recency bias or an availability bias or a status quo bias, and then to try and work out a technique to counteract that, I think is a waste of energy. And again, it's a labeling, so our brains are geared for seeking certainty. And so the label gives us the certainty we seek, but I'm not sure that it's helpful for optimal financial outcomes.
I want to share a story with you that happened last week, where we took clients through a process where there was some kind of risk profiling involved. It was a little bit more nuanced. And the client asked me, is this about my financial life or is it about my personal life? And it was so interesting to see how people could just easily separate them and say, oh no, I'm very conservative when it comes to money, but when it comes to my life, I like taking risks and I like taking chances and see where things. Why do we have such a disconnect, or how can we just compartmentalize money in such an easy way? Or would you argue that there's maybe a disconnect between the two?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting, that would be an interesting question to ask that client, but I think it's, in a sense, if I'm the opposite of that client in the sense. So I'm risk averse in my life. I think I might have shared with you before, riding a mountain bike, I'm very nervous and I'm very cautious. It doesn't always help. You can still have an accident even if you're cautious. But I'm not going to go and jump off that bridge across the Storms River or wherever it is. I'm not going to be doing any bungee jumping. So you could suggest then that I'm conservative, but when it comes to my money, I sure as hell need as much risk as possible, to get me to the financial goals that I have. And so I think for me, maybe I was overly critical of labels. The one area a label helps is as a catalyst for a conversation. So yes, okay. So you're conservative. So your client, you're risking in your life, and you're conservative in your money. What's that about? What do you think that's about? But I think, and it takes me back to where we began when what excited me about lifestyle financial planning, and the way that IPAC approached it at that time was to talk about the fact that when clients invest money, historically, the industry and the profession have treated, and the regulator have said, you've got to do a risk profile of a client to enable them to invest money. And your client asked a great question: is this a risk profile of my life or my money? Either way, it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant, because what actually is important is, what risk do you need to take for your money to do the work that it needs to do for you? And that's the risk that we have to work out. And actually, Rob, you got my idea what that risk is. I'm going to work it out for you as your financial plan. I'm going to tell you this is the risk you're going to take. Then we'll have a conversation about whether you have the appetite for that risk or not. But until then, let's not worry about it. Let's not even, let's do a risk profile for the fun of having a conversation or acting as a catalyst. But let's not take it too seriously, because it's not going to help, certainly in my case, and I think in many clients' case, not going to help me get to my financial goals or needs, because I would probably have all my money in cash if it followed the way I live my life.
Rob, you mentioned there that it's about the quality of the conversation. If financial planners are listening to this and they're wondering, how do we measure the quality of a conversation with our clients? What would your response be to that?
Okay, so the first thing I would say is ask your client for permission and record your next client meeting, and listen to the recording, and listen to how much you speak and how much your client speaks. If the 80-20 rule applies, as I think it probably will, then I'm guessing that financial planners probably speak for 80% and the client speaks for 20% on average. So that's the first step. Listen and hear what goes on in the meeting. And the next step would then be to say, okay, if I really want the client to work out what they need for their lives, and also help me understand them better, I need to get them to talk more. So I'd be saying, try and shift that ratio so that you as a financial planner only speak for 20% and let your client speak for 80%. But in order to do that requires some skill. And so there's sort of three skills that we need in a conversation. The first is a questioning skill. And so we need to be able to ask open-ended questions, because they force people to think and to talk rather than closed-ended questions. The second thing we need to do is to listen. And I know it sounds trite, because we all know we've got to listen. And we all listen bad. And so the real practice there is, how can I listen more effectively? And one of the ways, obviously, is just to be present in the meeting and to focus on what the client's saying, and try not let all the thoughts in one's head, distract you, and also try not to think about what your next question is or what you want to say. And the one way that one can ensure that happens is to allow more silence. So talk less, allow more silence. The third thing is, don't ever interrupt your client. So Nancy Klein, who's written a book called Time to Think, and various other books, talks about the fact that interruptions are arrogance masquerading as efficiency. So the reason that we interrupt is because we think we know what needs to be said next. And often the financial planner might think that, I know what the client needs now, so let me just interrupt. And also I want to be efficient, that we've got finite time. So don't interrupt. So it's ask open-ended questions, allow silence, don't interrupt. If you can just do those three things, I think the quality of the conversation will get better. And obviously the more you practice that, the better you'll get it. Yeah.
That is such a wonderful way of summing up the work that you're doing and through the coach training. And maybe this is a good opportunity to share a little bit, if someone has gone through that exercise and they realize, hey, I need help with this. Like, where would they start? What are the kind of things that you would be able to assist them with in the work that you're doing? Is there any new coach training sessions coming up that you might be involved in?
Yeah. So, I mean, I am involved with a program that's beginning in May with Adam Gray, which I'm not sure, where the numbers are for that program at this point. I'm currently running a couple of other programs which are already in progress. But I think if anybody is interested in having some training around this, welcome to get in touch with me. And in fact, I mean, I think the point you're making, which I think is an important point, is that this is stuff that we do need to practice, because it's a bit, I use the analogy of it, playing tennis, Rafael Nadal or Novak Djokovic, he's the number one player in the world. He's just broken Steffi Graf's record of the number of weeks at the number one spot. He has a coach. He has somebody who gives him feedback on how he hits the ball. He practices his backhand, his forehand, his serve. Even though he's the best in the world, he continues to practice, continues to get feedback. And I think for me, that's the lesson. However you do it, whether you do it in a one-on-one coaching engagement with somebody, when you do it in a training program, it's to recognize that these are skills that we do need to practice. And I know it sounds cliched, but they historically have been the soft skills, but actually they, I think, are the hard skills, and they require a lot of practice. I'm guessing that, what I would hope, financial planners listening to this who see the merit of focusing on their human skills, hopefully they see the merit of doing some work on it. Because I think that the scary thing is about the way we get educated is that, we get all this technical stuff from a very young age. We start doing maths when we're 6 or 7, we start learning to read and that, but we don't get trained in human engagement skills, throughout our formal education. There's no formal training. And then we get out in the wide world and, no wonder we have things like wars and disputes, etc., because we don't know how to talk to each other.
Yeah, just the awareness alone is not going to fix that.
Exactly.
I recently, in one of the meetings, I installed Crisp, which allows you to block out background noise. But one of the functions of Crisp, if you have an online meeting, is it measures how much time you speak and how much time the other person speak. I thought, okay, I think, and I having been through some of this training and spending a bit of time on it, I would imagine that I'm slightly better than average. Maybe it's an overconfidence bias, but I would have expected the score to be a little bit higher. And I was shocked, Rob. It came back that I spoke more than 70% of the time. Now, barring this wasn't a very deep conversation, but still, I almost felt so despondent, or I felt so despondent saying, wow, I really need to track these things, because my assumption was the client is speaking maybe equal amount of time, maybe a little bit more. Yet what this data, and I'm really hoping it was very inaccurate. This data is telling me that that's not the case. We need this constant feedback, and that's sticking out in my mind, because now I have a piece of information to address and to say, okay, how do I adjust that, and where do I go from here?
Yeah, and I think, that's a brilliant story, Louis. It's very brave of you to share that story. But I think one of the, what for me that highlights for us, and what we so seldom do, is on the programs that we run, and you would be familiar with this, we talk about this concept of action, reflection, learn, and that when we do something, if we're going to get any better at it, we have to reflect on it, and then in that reflection, as you are doing now, you're reflecting and saying, hang on, well, now what can I do differently? What can I do here? And so it's forcing that sort of learning piece, and that should to happen. The problem is that all of us get into this rut of action, doing, and we don't take the time to reflect. And again, I think using the sporting analogy again, if there's something we can learn from the sports people, is that, they will play a game. They're lucky because their games generally are televised, and then they will sit and watch it. and reflect and learn from it, and then see what they can do differently. And in an ideal world, client meetings would be filmed. So not only can you hear and see what the verbal sort of analysis is, but also see what you're doing with your eyes, with your hands. Are you really coming across as somebody who's engaged, or are you looking over the client's shoulder at the trees outside?
Do you know of anyone that's doing this? Like, are universities employing these tactics when they train young financial planners to have better quality conversations by recording it?
I'm not aware of it. I'm not aware, and so I speak under correction. I think there's an increasing recognition within financial planning circles of the importance of, we want to work financial psychology. So at the moment, I'm one of 5 people who are busy beavering away to make a contribution to a book on financial psychology, which, as I understand, will become a text for people doing their CFP. So I think there's a recognition that there is a need for this. I'm not aware of anybody, who's sort of doing that level of analysis and training, other than obviously if you come on one of the coaching programs that we spoke about earlier. But, but again, a coaching program is a finite event, whether it's 12 months or 16 months, it's a finite event. The challenge is to keep going and keep doing it and keep, having those reflections and that. So I would hope that in the same way that the therapeutic services, have supervision, peer supervision, where they will meet and share and discuss and deliberate, I would hope that we as a financial planning profession will move in that direction, where we can have not only peer supervision, but even, I'd like you to come and sit in on a meeting with a client, and I'd like you to give me the feedback of how you find my engagement with the client. In the same way that I would hope that professionals would view one another's financial plans and say, actually, would you have done this way, or how would you have done it? And I know that does happen within financial planning businesses where there are multiple advisors. There definitely is that sort of peer learning and peer support, but I think it could also happen inter business, if that makes sense, inter practice. So there's
Rob,
lots
it
of
sounds
opportunity
like we have a lot of work to do if we're going to beat out the medical profession in not only client experience, but in client impact, right? Because these things have the ability to change someone's life for the better and change a family's trajectory. So, I'm really excited. Thank you so much for being on the show today. As a parting comment, where would people be able to reach you if they want to find out a little bit more about what you're doing, or just engage in the work that you constantly put out?
I suppose it's a bad place to admit that I'm terrible on social media, but I can be found on LinkedIn. Otherwise, my email address, rob@fundhouse.co.za, is probably the easiest. I know it sounds a bit antiquated to talk about an email address.
Absolutely. But, wherever, if that works for you and someone buys you a cup of coffee and tackle you in Cape Town, that might even be better. Rob,
exactly.
All the best with the work you're doing, and thank you so much for making a massive contribution in the work of our business and just in my expansion as well. You've been instrumental. So thank you so much for that, and all the best.
Thanks very much for having me on the show. I've really enjoyed it. Cheers.